Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm DarkCaseX. The air disaster we are discussing today is different from the previous ones. It has been called the largest terrorist attack of the 20th century. It is also, in world and British history, the air disaster with the highest number of fatalities. A Boeing aircraft carrying 259 people, just half an hour after takeoff, was completely torn apart by a massive explosion. It disintegrated into countless fragments and fell from high altitude. The number of fragments exceeded 18,000 pieces, covering an area of over 2,000 square kilometers. The total number of fatalities was 270. The investigation into the disaster was exceptionally difficult, requiring more than 2,000 people to finally uncover the truth. Because the crash site of this disaster is in the small town of Lockerbie, UK. It is known as the Lockerbie bombing. So what exactly happened that year? Let's first go back to 1988 to review the details of the disaster. Lockerbie is located in the UK, a quiet town in southwestern Scotland. Although transportation here is relatively developed, being close to the A74 motorway, it doesn't have a strong presence. Many people don't even know this town exists, but today's story takes place here. However, the source traces back to London's Heathrow Airport. On December 21, 1988, London's Heathrow Airport was exceptionally crowded. It was the eve of Christmas, and people were rushing to go home and reunite with their families. Tickets for many flights were completely sold out. At this time, at the airport, a flight from Pan Am, Flight PA 103, was preparing for boarding. This flight was a scheduled flight from Frankfurt, Germany to Detroit, USA. Due to the long route, it would stop in London and New York. It would also change aircraft and crew members. Coincidentally, at Heathrow Airport, the aircraft was changed. Handling the next leg of the flight was a Pan Am Boeing 747-121. This aircraft had a very nice name, Clipper Made of the Seas. It was the 15th Boeing 747 built by the Boeing Company for Pan Am. It was delivered in February 1970 and had been in service for 18 years at the time. Its cumulative flight time exceeded 75,000 hours. It was no longer considered new. The captain was 55-year-old James McQuarrie. He had previously served in the U.S. Navy and had been working for Pan Am since 1964. His flight time exceeded 11,000 hours. With 4,000 of those hours on the Boeing 747, he was very experienced. The first officer, 52-year-old Raymond Wagner. He had previously served in the National Guard and had been working at Pan Am since 1966. His flight time exceeded 12,000 hours, with over 500 hours on the Boeing 747. He was even more experienced than the captain. The flight engineer was 46-year-old Jerry Averitt. He had also worked at Pan Am for over 8 years, with a flight time of over 8,000 hours, 500 of which were on the Boeing 747. There were also 13 cabin crew members and 243 passengers on board. Among them, 179 passengers were from the United States. To simplify things, we will refer to Pan Am Flight PA 103 as Flight 103. The scheduled departure time for Flight 103 was 6 p.m. However, a busy airport and bad weather caused the departure time to be delayed repeatedly. Finally, at 6:25 p.m., the plane officially took off and soon climbed to an altitude of 31,000 feet. Under normal flight conditions, it would take 7 hours to fly from London to New York. This was not a short time, so some passengers closed their eyes right after boarding, preparing to get some good sleep. But life is unpredictable. With the sound of an explosion, the nightmare began. At 7 p.m., which was 35 minutes after takeoff, Flight 103 smoothly entered Scottish airspace. At this point, the plane needed to turn west and fly towards the U.S. East Coast. At 7:02 p.m., most people on the plane were resting with their eyes closed. But suddenly, a violent explosion startled everyone. The explosion occurred near the aircraft's nose section, causing the plane to break apart in mid-air at 31,000 feet. This enormous, strange sound was also heard by the residents of Lockerbie. Some walked to their windows to look outside. They saw that the sky, which had been dark, had turned an eerie orange. It was accompanied by falling fireballs of various sizes. As the fireballs and debris hit the ground, the town's houses even began to shake violently. Some people thought an earthquake was happening and fled outside. But when they saw the wreckage falling from the sky, they quickly ran back indoors. Then, an even larger explosion completely jolted all the town's residents awake. The force of the explosion was so great that houses surrounding the blast collapsed. The houses at the epicenter of the explosion vanished completely. The surrounding area was a sea of fire. A massive crater appeared in the ground, with nearly 150 tons of earth blasted away. The Seismological Bureau at the time detected a 1.6 magnitude earthquake in the town. In reality, this was caused by the explosion. 11 residents were tragically killed in the blast. At that moment, no one in the town knew what had happened. Some even thought the end of the world had come, holding their children and praying fervently. A few minutes later, someone called the fire department, reporting that in Lockerbie there was an unknown explosion and fire. The fire continued to rage. The dark night was illuminated into an eerie orange by the flames. The fire department dispatched numerous ambulances and fire trucks and began firefighting and rescue operations. Let's rewind time slightly. At the same time the plane exploded in the air, Flight 103 suddenly vanished from the Scottish air traffic control radar screen. It had not issued any distress signal. Before the controller could figure out what was happening, many blips appeared on the radar, showing a pattern, continuous dispersal, and then they slowly disappeared. The controller couldn't reach the crew. With a strong sense of unease, he reported the anomaly of Flight 103. Pan Am was also very anxious upon hearing the news. How could the plane just suddenly lose contact? They could only keep trying to contact Flight 103. As the rescue operation in Lockerbie progressed, the situation gradually became clear. Someone at the scene found an intact ticket for Flight 103. Combined with the large amount of aircraft wreckage, it was basically confirmed that the missing Flight 103 had crashed. The typically low-profile and tranquil town became the focus of global attention. A large number of media reporters, police, and volunteers rushed to the town. What was certain at the time was that a plane had fallen from the sky. So the UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, AIB, quickly began their investigation. Subsequently, learning it was Pan Am Flight 103, the US Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, also got involved, beginning a joint investigation. Although the investigation team was large, the investigation of this air disaster was much more difficult and complex than usual. Much more complex. Just one thing alone, finding the aircraft wreckage, stumped the investigators. The day after the crash, as the sun rose, everything began to become clear. People finally saw what had truly happened. Town residents stated they had never seen such a tragic scene. The ground was littered with aircraft debris and victims. It was a total mess. 5 houses had simply vanished. The massive crater was later determined to have been caused by the aircraft's fuel-laden wing crashing and triggering a huge explosion. The crash debris spread outwards from Lockerbie, the extent of which far exceeded anyone's imagination. After calculations, the scattered area reached about 190 square kilometers. That's 1.8 times the size of New York City. Trying to find wreckage and debris from such a vast area was not a job for just tens or hundreds of people. In the end, the investigation team called in a large number of police and military forces. The number reached 600 people, adding the town's residents, volunteers, and so on. The total number exceeded 2,000 people. These people's primary task was to collect the wreckage. People formed single-file lines and began a grid search. Everyone held specially made bags. The bags came in 2 colors, white for aircraft wreckage and other debris, black for the remains of the victims. The order they received was that everything on the ground, as long as it wasn't a rock or a growing plant, had to be picked up and put in a bag. From the distribution of the wreckage, the investigation team already had an initial hypothesis. Flight 103 did not explode after hitting the ground. Although they had this deduction, in the dozen or so hours that followed, no one still knew what had happened. They only knew the plane broke apart in the air, and all 259 people on board were killed. Adding the 11 people in the town who died in the explosion, this disaster caused a total of 270 fatalities. Beyond that, they knew nothing. The UK and US officials in charge, and faced with reporters' questions, were also helpless. They could only keep repeating their apologies, stating it was not yet clear what exactly had happened. From the beginning, some speculated there were only two possibilities. First, the plane had a mechanical failure, or a design flaw. After all, this aircraft was an early model of the Boeing 747, and it had been in service for 18 years. It wasn't impossible for a malfunction to occur. Second, the plane was attacked. Terrorists either hijacked the crew and sabotaged the plane, or they brought explosives and blew up the plane directly. But speculation was just speculation. The investigation had to continue. Soon, the investigation team found a large piece of wreckage 4 kilometers away from Lockerbie. It was the plane's cockpit. What was strange was that other parts of the plane were very scattered after breaking apart, fragmented, but this cockpit was surprisingly intact. So intact that even the windows on its roof were undamaged. The remains of the captain, first officer, and 1 flight attendant were still inside. When nearby residents discovered the cockpit, the flight attendant, though severely injured, still showed signs of life. Unfortunately, she passed away before rescue personnel arrived. The investigation team found that all the instruments in the cockpit were in their correct positions, and all functions were operating normally. This was actually quite unreasonable. For such a severe accident to occur, the instrument data should have shown some abnormalities. There was only one explanation. The incident happened very suddenly. The plane disintegrated instantly. All control circuits were severed at the first moment, so the instruments didn't even have time to react. Before the entire cockpit separated, the search teams collected over 18,000 pieces of debris, trying to piece together clues from them. The difficulty of this and the complexity of the workload were unimaginable. The aircraft's cockpit voice recorder at 7:02 p.m. recorded a loud bang. This matched the time the plane exploded. Meanwhile, while examining the aircraft wreckage, the investigation team discovered a unique piece of metal debris. It was part of the plane's baggage container. This piece of metal had many small pits and pockmarks, and a portion of it was blackened by soot. This did not look like damage from a normal aircraft breakup. The team went to the location where this metal was found, and sure enough, they found more metal fragments from the baggage container. They all had similar pockmarks. 72 hours after the incident, FBI explosives expert Tom Thurman was invited to join the investigation. Based on his experience, Thurman immediately suspected it was caused by high explosives. Subsequently, the fragments were sent to a lab. The conclusion, just as Thurman had expected, was that it was indeed traces left by high explosives. This test result directly reclassified this air disaster as a terrorist attack. The nature of the act was extremely vicious. When the investigation team announced this news, the public was completely shocked, and many speculated about the terrorists' motives. Some analyzed that perhaps the killer's target was just someone on the plane, not the plane itself. The team checked the passenger list, and indeed found several U.S. government officials, namely U.S. Diplomatic Security Service agents, Daniel O'Connor and Ronald LaRiviere, the CIA's Deputy Station Chief in Paris, Matthew Gannon, and an official temporarily assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, Major Charles McKee. But these men had done many things. Trying to find something out from them was bound to be a long process. Just as the investigation team was struggling, The perpetrators seemingly turned themselves in. After the incident, multiple organizations issued statements claiming they were responsible for the Lockerbie bombing. Of course, the team didn't believe these self-proclaimed perpetrators. After all, every time a large-scale disaster occurs, similar groups jump out to take responsibility. But it was noteworthy that among the organizations claiming responsibility this time, one was from Iran. And just half a year earlier, on July 3rd, the U.S. Navy had shot down an Iranian passenger plane, Iran Air Flight 655. This resulted in 290 fatalities. The U.S. claimed it was an accident at the time. Iran was naturally displeased. It was clearly a deliberate attack, and they wouldn't admit it. The more Iran thought about it, the angrier they got. Many Iranians said they wanted revenge. So, an eye for an eye. You shoot down one of mine, I'll blow up one of yours. This motive seemed plausible. The FBI also investigated in this direction. But unfortunately, there were no leads. At this point, the Lockerbie investigation was proceeding in two directions. The FBI investigated suspicious organizations, while the AAIB continued to pore over the aircraft wreckage. Over the next few months, thousands of people began searching for answers among the 18,000-plus fragments. All the wreckage was transported to an aircraft hangar. In an attempt to piece it back into the plane's original shape, this method, though extremely tedious and labor-intensive, proved to be very effective. As the battered remains of Flight 103 were reassembled, investigators quickly discovered a large hole in the baggage hold area, near the nose. The wreckage around the hole was damaged in a way that was different from elsewhere. One difference was that it was blackened, as if scorched by smoke. Second, it was jagged, clearly showing it had been rapidly torn from the inside out. This was clearly the point of detonation. It seemed the bomb was hidden inside a piece of luggage. So the next step was to narrow it down further, find out which piece of luggage the explosion occurred in. The investigation team gradually reconstructed the scene based on the baggage container fragments. This time, they pinpointed a more precise location, the second layer of the baggage container. Upon investigation, a suspicious suitcase finally emerged. On the plane, there was a dark red Samsonite suitcase. Strangely, the owner of this suitcase had not boarded the plane. The investigation team also found the wreckage of this suspicious suitcase. The explosive residue on the fragments was very obvious. It seemed this was the source. The next step was to trace it back and find the owner of the suitcase. But it wasn't easy. This suitcase was first flown from Malta to Berlin. Then, from Berlin, it was flown to Frankfurt. Finally, in London, it was transferred via bypass onto Flight 103. As for its owner, they never appeared from start to finish. Clearly, this was a premeditated and meticulously planned bombing. Although only a few thousand of this Samsonite model were produced, their sales were sporadic, making it extremely difficult to trace. Fortunately, on some fragments of baby clothes, a large amount of explosive residue was also found. This indicated that these clothes were very close to the explosion, likely placed in the same suitcase as the bomb. While the suitcase was hard to trace, tracing these baby clothes was much easier, because these clothes were mostly sold in Malta. Remember, the suitcase also originated from Malta? So, investigators from Malta. This country is not large. After checking, they quickly found a clue at a clothing store. The shop owner said he remembered a strange man with a Libyan accent and appearance who had bought these baby clothes. It was raining at the time, and before leaving, the man also bought an umbrella. Coincidentally, at the Lockerbie crash site, they found an umbrella identical to the one the shop owner described. It also had explosive residue on it, indicating it was in the same suitcase. Unfortunately, only the shop owner had seen the suspected Libyan perpetrator. Finding him would be a long process. 1 year after the crash, the investigation team, in a piece of charred clothing, discovered a circuit board fragment. It was only half the size of a fingernail. Investigators guessed this might be a fragment from the bomb's timer, but after spending several months searching, they did not find a matching timer circuit board. Actually, this wasn't the first time the team had found a suspected timer fragment. They had previously found another very tiny circuit board fragment. It was later confirmed that the fragment belonged to a Toshiba radio. This model of radio also had a notorious nickname, the bomb radio, because criminals often hid bombs in this type of radio to commit crimes. Based on the two circuit board fragments found, the investigation team deduced that the perpetrator hid the bomb in a radio, then put it in the suitcase, and then sent the suitcase onto the plane. Investigators then sought help from the CIA. With the CIA's assistance, they finally found a timer with the same circuit board as the one from the crash site, the MST-13. This model of timer was manufactured by a Swiss company, MEBO. Only 20 were ever made. This timer could set a detonation time from 1 minute to 999 hours. All of them were sold to Libyans. What a coincidence. At that time, Libya and the US had major conflicts and constant military clashes, so Libya indeed had a motive to bomb the plane. At this point, the investigation turned entirely towards Libya. Fortunately, the clothing store owner in Malta had seen the perpetrator. After repeated confirmations, the shop owner identified the Libyan man who bought clothes from his store. Megrahi. On November 13, 1991, after a 3-year joint investigation and collecting 15,000 witness statements, the FBI and British authorities formally issued arrest warrants for Megrahi and his accomplice, Fima, issued arrest warrants. Megrahi was a Libyan intelligence officer who, at the time, was also serving as the head of security for Libyan Arab Airlines, stationed in Fima. At the time, Fima was a station manager at the Malta airport. The investigation team reasonably believed it was Fima, in his role as station manager, who cooperated with Megrahi to get the suitcase containing the bomb onto the plane. Although the UK and US issued arrest warrants, Libya refused to extradite the two men. They stated they had already placed the two men under house arrest, and if a trial was necessary, it could be held in Libya. The UK and US firmly refused. Over the next 3 years, neither side compromised, so the trial against the two suspects could not begin. The families of the victims were extremely disappointed. They knew who the killers were, but were powerless, filled only with rage. In March 1995, 6 years after the Flight 103 disaster, the US added Megrahi and Fima to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. The 441st and 442nd. Several organizations even joined together to offer a reward of $4 million, hoping to capture them. But there was still no progress. Next, multiple countries jointly imposed economic sanctions on Libya to pressure them. After several years of sanctions, by 1998, Libya really couldn't take it anymore and agreed to hand over the two suspects. However, not directly to the UK or US, but to a neutral location for trial. They eventually chose the Netherlands. The UK and US also agreed to this choice. With Libya handing over the men, the economic sanctions against Libya were suspended. Note, just suspended, not terminated. In early 2001, at a Scottish court sitting in the Netherlands, Megrahi and Fima were charged with 270 counts of murder. After a long trial, Megrahi was sentenced to life imprisonment with eligibility for parole only after serving at least 20 years. However, this was later increased to at least 27 years before parole eligibility. As for Fima, at the time of the offense, he had a perfect alibi, being in Sweden, so he was acquitted and released. Afterwards, Megrahi continuously appealed, always claiming he was the 271st victim of Flight 103, but the judges clearly didn't believe him. His appeal was rejected. He was incarcerated in a Scottish prison. The perpetrator had been tried, but the UN sanctions against Libya did not end. In 2003, under long-term economic sanctions. Libya couldn't hold out. Libya's leader at the time, Gaddafi, stated that although he never ordered the attack, he must take responsibility for the Lockerbie bombing and to the victims' families. He offered $2.7 billion in compensation, averaging $10 million per person, USD. After this, the UN finally lifted the sanctions against Libya. In August 2009, the Scottish government suddenly announced they would release Megrahi early. The reason was on compassionate grounds, as doctors had diagnosed him with a terminal illness and said he had less than 3 months to live. This met their criteria for release. At the time, the US repeatedly opposed the release, but to no avail. Scotland would not listen. In the end, Megrahi returned to his homeland, Libya, aboard Gaddafi's private jet. After returning home, Megrahi received a hero's welcome from his countrymen and was personally received by Gaddafi. As for the Scottish claim that he had less than 3 months to live, that was clearly not the case, as Megrahi did not pass away until May 2012. It is worth noting that the Wall Street Journal later discovered a letter personally written by Megrahi and not publicly released. The contents of the letter were baffling. It read, "I am an innocent man." In fact, many people did later come forward to say Megrahi was just a scapegoat. Regarding the key witness and evidence, many aspects were questionable. The entire case was very likely a miscarriage of justice. British legal expert Robert Black even publicly stated that the Megrahi case was the most shameful miscarriage of justice in Scotland for 100 years. Even later, some families of the crash victims campaigned to clear Megrahi's name. So the question is, do you think Megrahi was the killer? I don't know. I think this may remain a mystery forever. Originally, these events should have concluded with the death of the only convict, Megrahi. Should have concluded, but in reality, the investigation did not stop. In December 2020, 32 years after the Lockerbie bombing, the U.S. Department of Justice identified another suspect, Libyan Abu Aguila Masoud. He was accused of building the bomb used in the Lockerbie attack, and furthermore, of delivering the suitcase containing the bomb to Malta. He was one of the perpetrators. The U.S. then issued a red notice, requesting Interpol to monitor and arrest him. In 2022, 34 years after the disaster, the 71-year-old Masoud was successfully extradited to the U.S. to stand trial. The U.S. stated they are no longer seeking the death penalty for him. He will likely face life imprisonment and restitution. Currently, Masoud remains in U.S. custody, awaiting trial. Some might ask, what was their motive for bombing the plane? Because the victims in the Lockerbie bombing were mostly Americans, this incident was also seen as a terrorist attack against the United States. So, some analyze that, but from a motive standpoint, it was likely an act of retaliation against the U.S., not targeted at any specific individual. Although the cause of the disaster has been determined, and the relevant suspects have been found, apart from them, Pan Am also bears undeniable responsibility. The suitcase containing the bomb was transferred via London's bypass conveyor belt onto the plane. The owner of the luggage was not even on the plane. This was actually against regulations. There were clear rules at the time. Unclaimed baggage was not allowed on the plane. But Pan Am was not strict in checking this, which allowed the criminals to exploit a loophole. One more point. According to calculations, the plastic explosive hidden in the suitcase was between 208 and 400 grams. Although it had considerable energy, it was not enough to destroy the plane. So how did the plane disintegrate? Through the reassembled aircraft wreckage, investigators found that the plane itself had problems. The fuselage already had some age on it. A panel on the top of the fuselage was not securely attached. Ultimately, under the impact of the shockwave from the small explosion, the roof was blown off, which in turn triggered the plane's disintegration. In other words, the aircraft itself had a hidden vulnerability that Pan Am failed to detect in time. In fact, just 3 years after the Lockerbie bombing, Pan Am, due to the impact of this incident, declared bankruptcy. Following this experience, security at almost all airports worldwide was improved significantly. For example, security checks became stricter, and if luggage was unclaimed, it was absolutely forbidden from being loaded onto the plane, etc. Unfortunately, this vigilance was bought with hundreds of lives. Alright, that's all for today's story. If you like my videos, you can like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. We'll see you next time.